working in absolute isolation from one another. There was a big war totally isolating any communication or travel between Holland and Russia, which leads us to believe that something was going on as a response to Cubism. It's almost as though the movement from Cubism to pure geometric abstraction was almost built in. This is Pete Mondrian, taken in New York in 1943 during the last year of his life. I think we can say that Mondrian's paintings became the wellspring from which the Stijl movement occurred. The first thing we want to do is trace the evolution of Mondrian's work as an artist. I wish I had a color slide of this, but this was done in the late 1890s. Mondrian was in his 30s when he painted this. He was a respectable, traditional academic painter who had mastered the lessons of the Renaissance tradition well. Mondrian was totally committed to his art. In this painting from 1902, which is a landscape done on location in the lowlands of Holland, we can really feel the mushiness of this late winter or early spring ground. We can feel the coldness of the weather, the dampness, the wind. We admire the composition. The diagonal horizon line is one of the most stable devices used to design painting or any other kind of visual art or design. And the way Mondrian has placed this clump of trees as a focal point, the way he's treated the canal lines, the gullies as they move back in space, makes this a very classical, satisfying composition. To be sure, it's somewhat symmetrical, although asymmetrically balanced with the darker forms over on the left, but it has that kind of classical harmony that we look for in a well-painted image. In the middle of the first decade, Mondrian began to become interested in Expressionism. He was particularly impressed by the work of his fellow Dutchman, Vincent van Gogh, who was dead by this time, but nevertheless was slowly and steadily becoming known to artists and respected for his work. Mondrian began to heat up his image a little bit to make it more expressionistic. Note how he's treated these trees. He's really involving himself in the form and structure, the rhythm, the relationship of the negative areas of the sky to the positive branches, and he's stylizing and distorting this in order to better capture and express his feelings and the intensity and energy that he feels in nature. Energy is important. Mondrian was very much concerned about the forces at work in the universe and in the world. He was a very religious man, and he was intent at this point in capturing these in his paintings. Here's a variation of the same motif. We find here that the work becomes more expressionistic and less naturalistic. The color is intensified to intensify the symbolic value of color and to intensify the energy and vitality and the light that Mondrian finds in nature. Painting entitled The Red Tree. This is around 1907. Mondrian's sense of composition is becoming bolder. His involvement in structure is becoming more pronounced. His attitude toward color as being a subject matter in itself, as opposed to being something that makes reference to nature, is becoming more apparent in this magnificent painting. A tree is a living being. It's alive, it grows, it has energy. Mondrian was intent on getting those properties into this paint on canvas. The end of the first decade. It's a painting of a Dutch windmill. The palette is almost completely reduced in this painting to primary colors. The sky is made up of blue and yellow. The windmill is made up of red and blue. A tremendous intensity and vitality is imbued in this painting. It's a long way from the gray, brown, muted response to nature that Mondrian had earlier in this same decade. We note in this painting of a church that Mondrian has fragmented the sky into blue planes placed on a green background. At the top, note how those planes actually pull in front of the cathedral. Why did Mondrian do that? The sky is not made up of concrete planes, and they do not move in front of objects. Mondrian was addressing a pictorial problem. He was concerned with Cézanne's notion of the flatness of the picture plane. This warm church was moving forward, the cool sky was receding, and this was the device that Mondrian used to physically pull that sky forward. And also, I'm sure he was thinking about the symbolic aspects of the atmosphere. Surrounds things. It's not back behind objects, but it flows and moves. Wind energy is moving in front of this church. In 1910, 1911, Mondrian became aware of Cubism and other avant-garde movements occurring in Paris. By now, he was well into his 40s. He was an established painter. He had gained a great deal of respect as a traditional naturalist. He had become more of an expressionist. He was very curious. He took a train from Holland to Paris to go and find out what was going on. He visited the artists working in Paris, people like Picasso and Braque. He talked to them, found out about their work. He took a studio in Paris, and he began to assimilate the message of Cubism. This painting from 1911-1912 is called Still Life with Ginger Pot. Find that it's a beautiful blue ginger pot sitting on his tabouret in the studio. We see a painting cloth, a brush, some books, utensils. We see an easel in the background. Mondrian is becoming very much involved in a structure of planes. To be sure, we still have a strong sense of perspective and illusionistic depth and movement back into space. Compare that ginger pot still life with this other painting also entitled Still Life with Ginger Pot. I think we can say that Mondrian has crossed that line into Cubism. He is concerned with analytical Cubism, analyzing the planes of the motif that he sees in front of him, reinventing and restructuring these planes to create a new reality. With this wonderful sense of harmony and order that runs through his paintings, we see something that's happening that's very interesting and very prophetic. He's aligning his planes horizontally and vertically with the horizontal and vertical dimension of the canvas upon which he is working. So this repetition of horizontals and verticals brings a great deal of structure and order to the work. This painting of a woman, in a sense, is almost classical analytical Cubism. But as we look at the painting and think back to Picasso and Braque's analytical Cubist paintings, we find that there's a simplicity operative here. He's reducing the number of planes used to construct the image. Note the movement of light and dark, the way he has pushed the light forms to the periphery of the canvas, a very pronounced vertical movement, except for the form that represents the neck and face and nose of the subject, which pulls some light into the central dark complex and relates the central complex to the lighter outer planes. He was very conscious of that kind of harmony and order and the need to structure and balance. Mondrian began to respond to the built environment. In 1913, 1914, he began to paint paintings of facades, which would relate to cathedrals, apartment buildings. These paintings started to move toward a pure abstraction. We began to lose the reference to the subject matter. And he declared his intentions. He felt that Cubism had not accepted the logical consequences of its discoveries. This was the evolution of abstraction toward its ultimate goal, the expression of pure reality. What does he mean by pure reality? He is talking in the context of visual art. The pure reality of a work of art or design is the presence that it has in the perception of the viewer, apart from any reference to anything else. This is very close to the ideas that Malevich was arriving at half a war away in Russia at about the same time. The outbreak of World War I necessitated Mondrian's departure from Paris. He returned to Holland from 1914 on through the war years. He worked in Holland and became closely related to a group of other artists and architects. Tonality is diminished and color, hue, comes to the forefront in this painting. One of the big problems in any sort of design, whether it's fine arts or design, is what are you going to do with the corners? How are you going to deal with the corners? That can often be a problem. In this painting, Mondrian's dealing with them by not dealing with them, by making his image an oval placed upon a rectangle. This slide is slightly cropped off. He's been very studied and careful in the determination of intervals and the size of these planes. Mondrian is getting very interested in asymmetrical balance, form and counterform. A pink down in the lower corner will be balanced by a blue halfway up the canvas in a dynamic equilibrium. This painting from 1914 moves perilously close to abstraction. And here the color starts to move back. And we are faced with a composition of lines, a series of horizontal and vertical divisions of the space. Very intuitively, Mondrian is searching for absolute purity and absolute order. As a religious, philosophic man, as a man faced with a continent and a world in turmoil with this war, it becomes almost a passion for him. He was still very much concerned with this idea that he worked with before when we looked at the tree paintings and the cathedral and the red windmill against the yellow and blue sky, of somehow coming to grips with the forces in nature and the universe. But here, he's no longer dependent upon architectural form, clouds and sky and trees. He's attempting to make a graphic equivalent or a visual statement of the order and harmony that he senses existing in the universe. He's very much aware of developments in science and the notions of relational energy that were being developed in physics and chemistry. In this fateful summer of 1917, Mondrian became closely associated with other artists, one of whom was Bart Vender Lik. In 1916, Bart Vender Lik had reduced his painting to statements such as this. It's very figurative. but he's working with pure flat primary color, absolute flat surface and texture, making a very stylized schematic drawing of figures. There's a real vitality and energy force in this work. Mondrian and Bart Vender Lik hit it off. They understood that they had some common ground and some interests that were consistent with each other. Also from 1916 is this poster for an ocean liner by Bart Vender Lik, which in retrospect almost looks like we could call it an example of the influence of this style upon graphic design in the poster, only this is a year beforehand. Order is achieved by using these heavy black lines to zone or divide the space into a set of geometric shapes. The lettering becomes simple elementary letter forms, stripped of serifs, of 19th century ornamentation, of the sinuous curves of Art Nouveau, which were still around in a lot of graphic design, even as late as 1916, and making a very straightforward geometric presentation of the letter forms. Here's an interesting variation of that poster. The color is different, and the treatment of the type areas is different because we have white type on blue. Just a different palette and a different typographic treatment. Let's jump back. This is for the Rotterdam to London line, cargo and passengers. As is this one, but it's a variation. This is a preliminary study for the final printed poster. As these artists worked together, they developed a vocabulary, which is the vocabulary of de stijl. De stijl is pronounced de stijl in Dutch, and it means the style. They called their movement de stijl because they wanted this to be the 20th century movement. The vocabulary consisted of the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, plus neutral colors. They called black and white and tones of gray neutral colors that represented the presence or absence of light. They worked with the opposition of horizontal and vertical lines, which they determined was the most basic aspects of visual experience and invention. An upright human figure against a horizontal horizon, the building against the street. These, in man's experience, are the two primary movements. And then planes. Planes are the way we experience space. An area of color establishes a shape or a plane. This was pretty courageous to say we're going to throw out everything in art and design except these basic elemental properties: primary colors, neutral colors, horizontal and vertical lines, and planes. They were seeking an art that was pure and beautiful. The text notes that in the Dutch language, schoon means both pure and beautiful. And this was an important concept to them. Allegedly, Bart Vender Lik was the first artist to paint a painting using pure geometric colors, but they were so closely related that I think this is like Picasso and Braque developing analytical cubism. We have to look at it as a collective invention. This is a Bart Vender Lik painting from around 1917. We find that in this painting he's using lines and squares, and the lines become rectangles, of primary colors and black against a pure white field. This is by Theo van Doesburg. Through his energy, through his philosophic attitudes, through his embrace of architecture and typography, Theo van Doesburg is considered to be the founder and guiding spirit of the Stijl movement. He was the one who said, let's organize our thoughts into a movement. Let's publish a journal to disseminate our ideas. This is from a series of paintings of a dancer that moved from a dancer to an analytical cubist interpretation to this series of horizontal and vertical lines which capture the spirit of the dancer, the vertical movement, the movement of her arms and legs in a totally non-referential way. This painting is by Mondrian from 1917. In the slide, the blue squares are going black, but here a dynamic asymmetrical composition achieves perfect balance. They were concerned with this notion of dynamic equilibrium. You compose the picture, move things around, balance things until it's not possible to achieve greater harmony and